seems like they're talking, and I'm sorry to break it up.
Yes.
I know. I'm that terrible person who did that. Okay. So let's just open the floor and talk about some of the things that we might have talked about. I'm not giving out participation grades, so if I haven't heard from you yet, I'm not going to awkwardly stare at you and be like, that's what I do to my Anthro 101 students. Yes?
It's very simple for me to answer because homosexuality, like sex, was just not talked about.
Yeah.
It wasn't a topic.
Right.
So in my family, there wasn't anything about it.
We said that
It
here
wasn't
too.
brought
Yeah.
up.
Yeah. Nobody did not talk.
Yeah, I would say that's the same thing. I think the majority at our table is saying it just wasn't really a topic of conversation.
Unless you were from Ann Arbor. And then you thought gay couples, especially female gay or lesbian couples, we call them gay, but were the part of my life from the time I was a child, and they're very close family friends. It seems normal to me.
But you know, we were talking about the fact that just, to your point, Ralph, not talked about, but I will say from my family often will say is my daughter, does my daughter have a boyfriend? Or does my son have a girlfriend? I mean, that's what the grandparents want to know. Do they have a boyfriend? But I was saying here, I've got a nephew who's like 30, and people don't ask anymore if he has a girlfriend. Because he hasn't had any, and he may be A, right? I mean, I don't know. We don't talk at all about who he's dating, not dating. And I find that very interesting. Everybody else we talk about, does she have a boyfriend, does she have a girlfriend? So to me, there's a difference in the way if somebody is not connected with somebody in my family.
Yeah.
People sort of wonder what's happening there.
I said something similar, is that even just asking my grandchildren, and I stopped doing it.
Yeah.
Do you have a boyfriend or girlfriend? Sets up an expectation and is discriminating
Yeah.
in its context, and that
Y'all are amazing grandparents, by the way. I'm going to give you my grandparents' phone number, and you can give them a call. And when am I getting great-grandchildren? Not today. Not today. No, that was a compliment. I promise.
no, I know.
I think I'm much more conscious of that, those kind of statements that I probably tend that I would not have. Very much so. Which I think is a very good thing to recognize. Despite what we say subtly, influences.
Yeah.
And part of me just wants to scream, why does it matter?
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Why do any of those matter?
Why do we think it matters? I think this is a good thing to talk about.
Yeah.
I keep thinking about my husband, who I think is very uncomfortable with homosexuality, and I keep wondering why. And he has shared with me about going to a Boy Scout camp where he thought somebody was molesting kids, and I don't know if he's confused, that homosexuals are pedophiles, or I don't know what he's really thinking. And I guess for myself, I feel handicapped because I don't think I had any close, at least I didn't know about any close family members or friends until just very recently. I didn't grow up with the beloved uncle who's gay. I just didn't have anybody.
I think this is a really tough subject, but I would like to actually just hit the nail on the head right now with it, because I think this association between same-sex attraction, I go back and forth between homosexuality, same-sex attraction, gay and lesbian. They all mean the same things, but in different settings are more or less appropriate. Homosexuality has sort of fallen out of vogue in the way that queer has, and I use it here simply because it does denote a variety of folks with a similar sexual orientation. But now that disclaimer is over, often, especially from the 1970s on, when you saw campaigns to repeal gay rights ordinances, to deny gay couples the right to marry, you saw this association between homosexuality and crime of some sort, most often pedophilia or child molestation. for the most part, this is a creation of the folks trying to write these bills, right? We see the same thing now with the transgender bathroom bills, right? We want to pass the bathroom bill so that this person won't molest my daughter. More members of Congress have been arrested in bathrooms for I don't have that like as a statistic, but I can assume based on what I watch on the news that inappropriate advances in restrooms are not confined to one group of people and are certainly not inherently a transgender issue, as they were in a gay issue in the 1970s.
It's a lack of facts, not knowing the facts and not wanting to know them. And
Yeah.
just sort of enjoying, kind of reveling in the ignorance. You just don't want to know reality.
Well, and if you never talk about it, if you never have a conversation, then it's you have a void that you can easily fill with these assumptions.
Then the
Go ahead.
other really
Yeah.
strange piece of it, and here we are sitting in a church to talk about this, but how did it happen that churches who regard themselves as Christian, preach hatred toward a certain group of people? I can't put that together. My mind won't take it in. How did that happen? I could imagine not wanting to talk about it or being embarrassed, but to teach that it's acceptable to hate someone because they aren't just like you in every way. I can't even grasp that.
What's the history of the church and sexual orientation? Has the church provided opportunities for people like this? And I think they have. I think the nunnery and the monastery were social organizations because they had a diverse population as well. Am I wrong? I mean, I'm not a historian.
I think this is I hate to sound evasive by saying this is a complicated question. All these questions are really good and they're necessarily complicated then. Again, when we're talking about history, and especially church history, there weren't sort of homosexual men or women in the 12th century in the same way that there are in the 21st century. It didn't mean the same thing. There was, of course, sodomy, which was regarded as criminal in the Middle Ages and the early modern period, which denoted genital contact of people of the same sex. It meant that in Michigan until 2003 when the Supreme Court struck down that ban too. And in my state of Pennsylvania as well. But it's complicated in that way, right? Because there wasn't sort of a group of people who called themselves gay or lesbian. And so it's hard to trace that history. But the question about why the church has this sort of animus towards people who are gay or lesbian.
What's the basis of that? What's the danger?
It's badly interpreted.
Did you have something you wanted to say? You had
No,
your hand
I have a question.
Okay.
Finish.
It will be a
digression, so finish.
My third question, not to give away too much of what's coming, but my third question is about being Christian and LGBT affirming, and I think one of the things I want to talk about in that section is how we can figure out sort of not necessarily the basis for that hatred, but how to combat it. And how to talk about it in a way that's respectful and helpful to everybody involved. So I'm going to put that not on the back burner, but like the bridge burner. So I have it right here. And we'll talk about it in a minute. But what is your question?
It's more, you had asked a little bit ago.
Yeah.
Why do we ask, or what's the motivation for saying, do you have a girlfriend, do you have a boyfriend? And I would ask whether or not it's, geez, I hope they got a girlfriend, or I hope they got a boyfriend. At some conscious or unconscious level, it's, boy, I hope they aren't one of them.
And that might also help answer your question a little bit in the sense that this sort of stigma is self-perpetuating. As long as we sort of have these thoughts in the back of our mind. So we know, and there's data to support that LGBT people are often the victims of crime, the victims of discrimination, the victims of social stigma. There are people you don't talk about in the same way as you talk about other members of your family sometimes. And so if you know that social stigma is out there, it probably wouldn't be something you would want your child to be but that doesn't, that's sort of self-perpetuating, right? Because as long as that discrimination and that sort of, not even discrimination, but just the idea that gay people are somehow less than straight people, in the way that they love, in the way that they cohabit, in the way that they have families, that sort of perpetuates this stigma.
But I'd
Well,
like,
well, go ahead, please.
yeah, I'd like to take your comment about, why do we ask this question, right? One is I'm hoping the answer is less than so, but the other side of that is, I think a lot of us ask that question because we know that a long-term loving relationship that's satisfying is a great thing in a person's life. And so if we ask that question, we say, how is your life progressing in terms of finding a long-term partner, okay? And we know at least from our traditional experience, right, or our legacy experience, that this is a satisfying thing. I recently gave my son a book, The Millionaire Mind. And it's a book about how to be frugal, how to become a millionaire. But there's a big chapter on there, and what do you do when you choose a spouse? Okay? And I gave it to him saying, you should read this chapter, because if you find a long-term relationship, a partnership that's going to be lasting and satisfying and full of love, it can also complement your economic status. And so, why do people ask that question? Right? Because it's a stepping stone in people's lives.
And if we've experienced that, we would wish so much for the people we love to experience that too. We would love to see them in that kind of situation.
Well, I think actually in concert with what other folks said, I think the other thing would be, a part of the reason for asking that question is, we don't want our kids or our grandkids to be exposed to the discrimination and all of the other things. So it's not entirely a selfish.
No, not at all.
I think it's thinking of their well-being. So there's a multitude of factors that drive that question, I think.
But I think, just really quickly, I'm keeping track of the hands, because I agree with you 100%, that again, that these questions aren't necessarily motivated, they're not meant to, usually to entrap people or to make people feel bad. Having a family and raising a family is, for us as Americans, a core cultural value. It's something that has been and will continue to be for a very long time, and it's something that people want for children and grandchildren often, especially if they've experienced that. But I think the important thing about this conversation is that we're seeing that, again, this sword cuts both ways. That this can also, if your life doesn't necessarily map onto that plan at that point, that might make you feel a little bit less than. So you two had questions. Whoever wants to go first.
Go ahead. But no, I look at also, I have a young child, and after my son was born, my husband and I had a discussion. And basically we said whatever our child chooses is what we are going to respect. Because if you look at the suicide rate of the kids who are not accepted, I mean, it's in the 70 or 80 percentile. And
with attempts.
With attempts, exactly.
Yeah.
Not right, with the attempts. And that, to me, is a very sad thing. So.
I just, more had I guess a comment, question, rhetorical. So from what I'm understanding, what you're saying is the concept that you're talking about of LGBTQ is really sort of a novel thing in our current cultural framework. So for us to struggle with it personally, or through our families, or through institutions such as the church or the government, it's not to be unexpected by any stretch of imagination. It's only really been a thing or how it's defined for 50 years.
I mean, this is something that came up, this comes up frequently. I'm going to go back to the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court in many ways has litigated from sodomy legislation to marriage legislation what is socially acceptable and unacceptable in the United States. And so you often hear something sort of quite the opposite of that. There's an assumption that there have always been people who are homosexual in the same way that we now understand it, and that there has always been a condemnation of those people, and that's not necessarily true. Again, this sort of LGBT identity is rather novel. So talking about sort of how did people in 12th century England deal with gay people is like asking how 12th century England folks dealt with astronauts, right? They just weren't there yet. This is something that we've gotten to culturally over a long span of time, in the same way that we got to astronauts in the 50s and 60s, in ways that we imagined something like them before, but that wasn't sort of a pressing thing. We weren't allocating government money to NASA in the 1860s. So I agree with you that it makes sense that this grappling is happening, because in many ways, of all of the sort of, I study a sort of bunch of social issues that folks grapple with, and LGBTQ issues are changing so rapidly. If you think of same-sex marriage, for example, the first state to allow same-sex marriage was Massachusetts, and that was in 2004. A year before that, at least a dozen states had sodomy laws saying that people of the same sex could not, in their homes, achieve coitus. And then, a decade later, in 2014, 2015, you have the entire country moving. So the acceleration is very quick, and the backlash has also been quick. So if you're feeling a little bit of whiplash when we're talking about this, it's completely to be expected.
Sometimes things change fast. I always think about going to college in 1968 and basically being locked in a dorm. And in 1972, men and women were living on the same floor. It was 4 years of, that was a revolutionary.
Yeah.
And so I think, that span of time, things change a lot in a short time, and then and it goes from there.
Social norms are a really powerful thing, and if we've seen this, all of a sudden marriage has become a norm. We see it on TV, we've seen it in our pop culture. So, I mean, think about wearing seatbelts in the 70s. Like, nobody wears a seatbelt. Now it'd be really weird when you see people not wearing seatbelts. So it's a social norm, and it can happen like that. As long when that reaches that tipping point, where you realize it's not a weird thing, it's a normal thing. And I think that's what the whole point of this is. It's a community, it's not a weird thing.
This is the perfect segue into my next question. It's going to seem like I stole it from you, but I had it in my head beforehand. This is not on the board, completely open-ended. When was the first time you saw a gay male character on television?
Oh my goodness.
Three's Company?
So?
He wasn't.
I think it was So.
I heard Batman.
I said that.
Was this assumed or validated?
Just throwing it out there.
Well, what about Red Ryder, Steve Roper? Who?
Okay.
They were.
What about a lesbian character? This one's probably a little bit easier.
Ellen.
And when did Ellen come out? Mid-90s? Early 90s? Late 90s? I don't remember.
I think just recently they had a 20-year retrospective.
Okay. So it must have been later 90s. What about a transgender character?
Jazz. I am Jazz.
And when did that air?
2 or 3 years ago.
What was that?
The Crying Game.
The Crying Game.
Who?
Crying Game.
That was
That was
Neil
93.
Jordan. That was 93. Okay.
93, 94.
But this is something to think about, and even if there weren't characters on these TV shows or in movies that had like sort of the Ellen moment where it was sort of publicly declared, there were people that you might have sort of suspected or thought a little bit about. But the idea, which goes to your point, is that with social norms, visibility is a really big thing. So if you're not talking about the issue, or if you have sort of an idea in your mind of how to respond to that issue, and you have nothing to challenge that, then that can be perpetuated, right? So if you have this,
Talk about it. If you have to pretend it doesn't exist, how can you get it?
But if you turn on the TV and are suddenly faced with it, or if you turn on the news, or if you open a book, because gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual characters have also proliferated literature and have become more and more prevalent in the last few decades. Visibility is huge.
Even retailers have started featuring LGBT couples.
Absolutely.
In commercials, which has been, I mean, that's just been the last few years.
And what do those commercials look like? Sorry to press you, but I think that's a good point.
I think a lot of them have done a really good job at just making LGBT couples part of everything else. I know there's one ad now that I see that it's kind of like it talks about the critical moments in life, and it shows a few different couples getting married, and one of them just happens to be a gay couple. And I think that is done for people who have previously tried to shut that out. It's there, and it's in their face. Where before they could kind of choose to ignore it.
So it's doing sort of double work there, right? Because it's promoting this visibility and it's being inclusive, but it's also sort of normalizing in a way that for many is very helpful, right? The gay or the lesbian couple is going to JCPenney just like the straight couple, and they're all sort of arguing over what color of sheets to get. It doesn't matter your gender or your sexual orientation. The blue stripes are a bad idea. Blue stripes are always a good idea, by the way. But yes, I think we've hit a point now where the visibility is really high and the visibility is starting to have sort of a normalizing effect. Which again, it's a sword that cuts both ways. The more something is normalized, the easier it is to ignore sort of discrimination. So, like I said, in a majority of states you can be fired for being gay, but it's easy to turn on the TV and see and watch Modern Family, for example, and think, oh, if you're a gay couple, there are no problems ever. Not if you live in certain states or in certain towns or in certain areas.
I think the two biggest things that I've found shock people the most is the fact that, one, you can be fired for being gay, and two, that you can't give blood.
Yes.
And people are amazed that in 2017, I, as a gay man, cannot give blood. When there are heterosexual individuals who are much more promiscuous than I am.
Yeah. But again, the blood ban is again based on a stereotype and based on a presupposition that connects gay men in particular to the notion of promiscuity. In the same way that we talked about the association between same-sex attraction and crime. And again, that doesn't necessarily hold up from a demographic standpoint, especially in the 2010s when marriage is possible and cohabitation is possible in ways that they weren't in the 1950s and 1960s.
My daughter in Pittsburgh, who often will have little kids in her car and they're going to hockey, and this happens to be so many little boys in this neighborhood, it's kind of crazy. And they're 11 and under in that age group. And they are very supportive of, their norm is so much different, is a different norm. And she listens to them talk like it's a different conversation than she ever maybe expected to ever hear from 11 and unders, but they have, your sister-in-law and her wife come with their two daughters, and that's the norm, it's that's the norm, and they get to see that it works out, or they have struggled. I mean, it's the same. And so I think that my grandkids have will never have a view that I worked around and came out seeing. But it's the norm, and they support, and they hear it supported.
There are a lot of areas and children that age, where that is not at all the norm. So it's still.
But we are seeing demographic shifts. I'm sure after the election you saw all over social media if only people who made over $65,000 and lived in Connecticut voted, how that would have voted. Like, if only millennials voted, it would have been a certain outcome. And at this point, around 60% of the country supports same-sex marriage. And that's not necessarily a benchmark to determine how LGBT inclusive you are, but it's a good start, right? And a vast, vast majority of millennials support gay and lesbian rights and transgender rights. And it doesn't matter if you are in a blue state or a red state, or you're in a mainline church or an evangelical church. Even in some of the most conservative religious denominations, people who are younger are leaving in droves because of this particular issue and the church's very hostile stance on it. Some are staying, of course, but many are leaving.
And that's why I guess I kept looking at your question. How can we be in a church and how can we be arguing about this? But does it come back to the issue of basic belief now is it a matter of choice or is it genetic? Is that what divides the churches?
Well,
I mean,
you have to remind yourself that there are quite a few people who don't believe in science at all.
well, I know. So that's what I mean. The basic issue is in accepting and being inclusive. What is your bottom line? Where does that come from? Do you believe it is a choice, a bad choice, or do you believe genetics play a role? I mean, and is that what divides the communities? See, that's what I think.
Tried, when we were talking, I said, I'm from a Baptist background. Baptists haven't really been inclusive to the community. But I had a lesbian aunt who was welcomed into the family. But when I came out at 35, I was still scared because I was from that Baptist background. And what was my family going to say? What were my friends going to say? You know, was I still going to be welcoming? Some friends that I had known my life, I got letters from, chapter and verse, you know, that I was going to hell. Now I go to a Southern Baptist church, which they're not real accepting either, but on an individual level, half the church knows that I'm gay and I'm accepted there. Now, if I got a partner and showed up with a partner, that might be a different issue.
But you don't feel like you have to pretend to be different than you are when you go into the church? You don't have to kind of, you know, probably, you know that struggle when you're trying to act like you're something different than you are, how hard that is, you know?
Right, that is hard.
And you don't
yeah.
have to do that when you're in your church?
Nope, I don't. The pastor knows, his wife knows, a lot of the ladies know. The time that I do have a tough time is in Sunday school sometimes, when this issue comes up. And sometimes I just get so infuriated, I just have to walk out.
I would just add to this gentleman's point, and this is kind of a local experience for everyone to wrap their minds around. So for me, I was a member of a church that I had gone to for 8 years in Adrian, so local. I was an usher. I was on the praise team every Sunday, and when I came out, it was, you're making a choice, and you can no longer be a part of any of those things.
Yeah.
You can be a part of the church, but you can't serve the church.
Right.
After spending 8 years in a church that preached to me, if you're going to be a member of a church, that means you have to serve the church. So this is a church that I always thought was very forward. We had a female pastor with purple hair, and so that was a shock. And I think for a lot of people in the church, they were kind of distraught over that decision because for the first time they related to someone that they knew before they were gay, and they realized that we didn't have 3 arms and everything else. But that was, for me, and that was in February of 2016. So this is very recent. So right here in Lenawee County, people are being forced to walk away from church families that they've been part of for almost a decade.
So did you go church shopping?
I did for a while, but I think that experience was so difficult, and to build almost a decade worth of relationships, to think of starting that over again, it's not been easy.
But I did go church shopping. And I went to a church in Chelsea, which was an Episcopal church, because I had lesbian friends that went there. And I went there for a while, but I always go back to the Baptist church.
It's those old.
Because that's my foundation, and my friends say, why do you go there if they don't accept the LGBT community? And I said, well, they accept me. You know, so.
I think it's worthwhile
It's
to
hard.
bring up here really quickly that another drawback to a lot of silence on this particular issue is that you tend to think of it in abstract terms. At the beginning, we talked about I and we terms. You start to deal with people in sort of absolutes. Gay people are like this. Churches are like this. People are treated like this. And then you start to hear individual stories, and I want to thank both of you for sharing your stories. That takes them out of these sort of abstract senses. When you start to see how actual people on the ground have to deal with discrimination, if that's sort of in-your-face discrimination or if it's wanting to walk away in Sunday school, right? Because that can be very hurtful too. And being asked to leave is obviously heart-wrenching. And all of these things are different experiences. I want to move to our third question because it sort of hits on this. And this is really sort of a brainstorming question. And this is how to approach LGBTQ issues from a Christian perspective. So we've talked about a lot of sort of the nuts and bolts and a lot of the presuppositions. And I'm getting a sense in the room that we all feel some type of way. And the question then is, what do we do with that feeling? How do we articulate those feelings? I haven't forgotten your question about choice v. science, and I will address that in a bit. But I think that's really well defined in here. So I have a bunch of things here, but the main question that I want you to think about for the next few minutes is how to approach LGBTQ issues from a Christian perspective. So think about things that a church could do. Think about what stories or even what Bible verses you could use. Think about what kinds of conversations need to be had. I think this is one of them. And that this is the kind of topic that can be addressed. And think about, I think this might be the hardest question, and this is sort of the pillar of my dissertation, so if you answer it, I'm going to interview you and write it down. What actual actions can you take to be inclusive? Not even just to LGBTQ people, but just to be inclusive. Think about that as you go through, and just take a few minutes.